The zombie apocalypse. You've seen it in books, movies, comics, TV shows, video games, but what are the chances of it happening in real life? Let's take a moment and talk about it. Hello and welcome back to Moment of Zen, a podcast about everything and nothing. And as always, I'm your host, Johnson Zen. And before we begin, I just want to thank everyone again for their support. You have no idea how grateful I am with all the support and feedback that I've been getting from all of you. And also, please, if you can rate this podcast on iTunes, it really helps to get more exposure so this podcast can grow. And thank you all again so much. Enough of that now. Let's get started with the zombie apocalypse. The zombie apocalypse. It's probably one of the most talked about and fictionalized end of the world scenarios probably within the past, I'd say, 10 to 20 years. And if you don't know what a zombie is, then either you've been living under a rock for the past 20 years or you're too young for this podcast. No, I'm just kidding. You're never too young for this podcast. This is a family show, so parents, let your kids listen, and kids, stay in school, eat your veggies. Anyways, the zombie apocalypse. You've heard it all before. Zombies take over humanity by infecting everyone they see. They wipe out an entire city in an instant, and over time, they'll claim a country and eventually take over the world. But before the end of the world, how could this happen? It only takes one person to destroy the entire world. One person to rule them all. And that person is patient zero. So if you haven't noticed yet, today I will be talking about the different possibilities of the zombie apocalypse happening in real life. Whether you're a skeptic or a believer, I don't think you can deny the popularity of the zombie apocalypse scenario, at least in pop culture. And if you're a skeptic, then maybe I'll convince you that the probability isn't zero. And if you're a believer, then you better start preparing your shelter and your contingency plans. I think before I go on discussing our impending doom, I think it would be a good idea to talk about the history of zombies and provide a kind of a baseline definition for what a zombie is. This will get us all on the same page on what kind of zombie we're talking about, especially since they're all different kinds of zombies in different media, and they're often depicted very differently. First of all, let's talk about the definition of a zombie. In the most basic definition, a zombie is a reanimated corpse of a dead being. That means you can have zombie animals like cats and dogs, as well as humans. The first recorded use of the word zombie, in English at least, was in 1819 by an English poet named Robert Southey. Robert Southey. It was spelled Zombi, and it was actually referring to a man named, forgive me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Zumbi, who was an Afro-Brazilian leader that led anti-slavery and anti-colonial resistance against the Portuguese in Brazil during the late 1600s. So the origins of the word zombie in English was basically an English guy butchering another person's name. Classic English. You're probably thinking that has nothing to do with zombies. And you're right. The word zombie that we know it to be actually probably comes from a place you probably never expected. Haiti. In Haitian folklore, a zombie, spelled Zombi, is an animated corpse raised from the dead through witchcraft or voodoo. So according to Haitian tradition, zombies are dead people that have been revived by a sorcerer or a witch, also known as a Bokor. Hopefully I'm getting that right. So the Bokor that summoned the zombie has complete control of it because it is believed that although the person is physically dead, the soul of that individual still resides inside the physical body. And the Bakor can capture and enslave that soul, and then that soul becomes reanimated, which becomes the zombie. So the word zombie actually comes from Haitian French, but the concept and idea of zombies actually comes from parts of Central and or West Africa. There's a little bit of debate of where exactly in Africa it originated, but it made its way to Haiti through the slave trade. Interestingly enough, Haitian zombie folklore is also deeply rooted and connected to slavery. It is thought that the voodoo deity Baron Samedi would gather the souls from the dead and carry them into the afterlife. However, if a person has offended the deity in any way, he would sell their souls to a Bakor where they will be resurrected as a zombie and remain a slave forever. And slave drivers on the plantation, who were usually slaves themselves and sometimes act as voodoo priests, would use this fear of zombification as a way to discourage slaves from committing suicide, because committing suicide was a way to offend the deity. This way, slaves will literally have to work themselves to death in order to not become a zombie. The West's first exposure to the concept of zombies came around during the US occupation of Haiti, which lasted from 1915 to 1934. And in 1929, the book The Magic Island, written by W.B. Seabrook, was published, and it was a detailed account of Haitian voodoo. And Time magazine claims that this book was the first introduction of the word zombie into English, or at least zombie into English as the zombie that we know it, not some English guys butchering of the name zombie or zombie. So that's basically the history of the origin of zombies. I know a lot of people, even the most dedicated of zombie lore fans, would point towards the movie The Night of the Living Dead as the origin of the idea of zombies, but that's not true. In the movie, the word zombie was never referenced, and the undead in that movie were actually referred to as ghouls. And on a quick side note, ghouls were originally derived from Arabic folklore, and they're more kind of in the line of a demon than an undead. And it wasn't until the sequel that the undead were referred to as zombies. The first zombie movie was actually a movie called White Zombie, which premiered in 1932, about 30 years before The Night of the Living Dead. And that movie was actually based on zombie voodoo described in the book The Magic Island, and it tells a story of an evil voodoo master transforming a woman into a zombie because of love and jealousy. Think of it kind of like a little bit like Romeo and Juliet for zombies. Honestly, it wasn't a really good movie, but for being the first zombie movie, I cut it some slack. And now we're all caught up with the history of zombies. Now, how are they going to kill us? So I did a lot of research into different movies, games, TV shows, and cross-referenced them with actual science. And I found 3 possibilities for how zombies could happen in real life. Are you ready for this? So the first and probably the most popular zombie origin story is through a virus. You've probably all heard this before. A strange new virus infects someone and they slowly lose their sense of reality and become increasingly aggressive until they succumb to the virus and become a full-fledged zombie. The virus is then spread through zombies biting their victims, and in some cases, even spreading through scratches or just contact with bodily fluids. The best example of this type of zombie that I could think of is probably the zombies or walkers in The Walking Dead. And I know for those diehard fans of The Walking Dead, Before you call me out and say that the origins of the walkers were never clearly explained, in season 2, I believe, Dr. Jenner, the scientist at the CDC, he did mention something about the infection being, quote, in our blood. So it likely points to a viral infection. And please don't crucify me because I'm not the biggest fan of The Walking Dead. I just know enough about it. And it's safe to say that it is a viral infection based on the evidence. So now that all of the Walking Dead fans have probably left the podcast, now it's time to ask the real question. Is there already a zombie virus among us? Not quite, but there are individual viruses that each contain the ingredients for a zombie virus. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll explain that in a little bit. So the first, what I call ingredient of the zombie virus, is the extremely dangerous virus rabies. So for those of you who don't know, rabies is a viral disease that causes inflammation in the brain and infects humans and other mammals. Some of the initial symptoms of rabies include a fever, headache, followed by extreme paranoia, anxiety, confusion, hallucinations, and possible delirium. These symptoms could cause a person to become extremely violent, and there have been cases where an untreated rabid person has attacked other people, and in one case, spread the disease to another person after biting his victim. Which brings me to how rabies is transmitted. So rabies are typically transmitted when an infected animal scratches or bites its victim. Sound familiar? Oh, before you panic, I just want to say that even though rabies has a pretty much 99% fatality rate, that it is a very incredibly rare viral infection. And if you live in either the North America or around Europe, you're probably not going to get rabies. It is not normally found in humans. You normally find it about 99% of the cases of rabies transmitted into humans is through a rabid dog or through a bat. Just know that that most rabid dogs are stray dogs. So your best friend, don't worry about him. He's not gonna kill you. And if you're afraid of dogs, don't be. They're awesome animals. Go adopt a dog. So the second ingredient for the zombie virus are a category of infections called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, or TSEs for short. The most common of these infections that you may be familiar with is mad cow disease. Fortunately, the disease is not spread through a virus or bacteria, but it's spread through a prion, which is made up of proteins. That means you can only get infected with this disease if you consume tissue containing the prions. Sounds strangely familiar, doesn't it? Zombies kind of ring a bell? Anyways, some of the symptoms of TSEs are personality changes, lack of coordination, confusion, memory loss, and in the later stages of the disease, dementia, losing the ability to speak. Unlike rabies, there is no known case of humans getting infected by biting a victim. So you're not going to get a TSE by biting a victim. No. You get it by eating another victim. And why do I say that? Well, there's an extreme case of a TSE known as Kuru that affected the Foray people of Papua New Guinea. These people were infected with the disease because they practiced ritualistic cannibalism, where they ate the flesh and brains of their dead as part of a funerary ritual. And not to judge, that's what they did. I'm not saying it is weird based on Western standards, but you just need to understand that they have a different culture and they don't do this anymore. So Yeah, other than that, there is no known cases where the disease spread human to human. And in most cases, people who do get affected with TSC, they get it through eating contaminated meat, like meat from cows, sheep, goats, just your traditional meats. Nothing fancy like human meat. And finally, the last main ingredient of the zombie virus is one we all probably know, which is the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. So you're probably asking, what does HIV have to do with zombies? Well, for one thing, it only affects humans and other primates. HIV can be transmitted through contact with infected blood. But that's not the reason why HIV is part of the mix for the zombie virus. One of the scariest aspects of HIV is how rapidly HIV mutates and evolves. The virus constantly evolves into a new strain of itself as it replicates in the cells. This is one of the main reasons why an HIV vaccine is so difficult to effectively produce, because the virus evolves so quickly, which makes vaccines that may work on an older strain of the virus ineffective against a newer strain. If you make a vaccine for HIV in one person, it may not work for another person because the strain of HIV in another person could be completely different because of the way the virus has evolved in that person. So now, imagine if you combine rabies, TSC, and HIV together. What do you get? Well, you get a highly infectious virus that's transmitted through human to human contact of blood and flesh that also evolves very quickly, making vaccines virtually ineffective. Sounds pretty much like every zombie movie you've ever heard of. Am I right? Before you freak out, I want to point out that even though I'm not an expert on diseases or viruses, I know the super hybrid virus is highly unlikely. The reason for this is that, first of all of these diseases are incredibly different from each other. The species of the rabies virus is completely different from the HIV virus, kind of like how we're a different species than a dog. And plus, TSC isn't even a viral infection. It's an infection that affects the proteins in our brains. This means that hybrid disease is just highly unlikely. So does that completely rule out a zombie virus? Yes and no. Rabies is currently the closest we have to a zombie virus, and I suppose it's possible that a rabies virus could evolve into a zombie virus, at least as a zombie virus as we know it, but it's highly unlikely. The more possible scenario for the zombie virus is not from a hybrid of viruses, but rather a combination of viruses. It could be possible that maybe you're an extremely unlucky person who got infected by a different strain of rabies, or who also happens to have HIV and maybe some other viral infection. And the point I'm trying to make is that maybe the zombie virus that we think of is just having the right combination of different viral infections happening to you at the same time. Like the zombie virus, this virus is highly contagious and can be transmitted through bodily fluids like blood or saliva. So now that Purell's stock price has skyrocketed, let's move on. And Purell, if you want to sponsor this podcast, I'm not opposed. So moving on. The second possibility for the impending zombie apocalypse is through a neurological parasite. So the biological definition of a parasite is an organism that lives inside another organism or the host. Parasites exploit their host for nutrients and resources. They usually have a faster reproductive rate than their host and reproduce and grow inside their host, with their offspring taking more of the host's nutrients and resources. And parasites can be a wide range of organisms like animals, plants, fungi, worms, bacteria, and even viruses. And the most common parasite that you've probably heard of, at least that infects humans, are tapeworms. So if you eat undercooked food like a rare steak or raw food like sushi, and those foods are infected with the tapeworm, you could also be infected with the tapeworm. They'll live inside your intestines and basically eat and absorb all the nutrients and vitamins from the food you eat, leaving you malnourished and leaving you malnourished. And a fun fact, the mistletoe that you hang under the walkway is actually a parasite. So think about that the next time you kiss someone under the mistletoe. So tapeworms aren't going to turn you into a zombie. They're an intestinal parasite. A neurological parasite, on the other hand, is a different story. So the best example of a neurological parasitic zombie that I could find is in the video game The Last of Us. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the game, the quote zombies in the game have been infected by a fungal parasite. And just a quick note, in the game, they're never actually referred to as zombies. They call them infected, and there are different types of infected, but I'm not going to get into that. If you know the game, you kind of know what I'm talking about. But moving on, so according to the Last of Us wiki, the fungus is a mutated strain of Ophilocordyceps unilateralis. So this fungus attacks the brain of its host, and once infected, the victim gradually loses their ability to freely think and begin to act erratically as the fungus spreads across the brain. The infected brain will then resort to its most primitive animalistic instincts and attack anyone that disturbs it. And the fungal parasite then spreads either through contact with an infected person's bodily fluids or through fungal spores. So even when an infected person dies, the fungus inside the brain continues to grow and releases spores so that it can continue living inside of another host, which means that the infection is both airborne and you can get it through physical contact. There's a lot more game lore about the different stages of growth and how the fungus affects the person, but you can read that on, if you're interested, on the Last of Us wiki. Or if you know the game, you probably know a little bit more about how the infected work in that game. So that's pretty scary, right? And if you think, oh, that's just a game, I guess life's a game. In real life, there really is actually a fungus called Ophilocordyceps unilateralis. It infects ants that reside in the rainforests of South America. And once the fungus infects the ant, it releases chemicals that attack the ant's central nervous system, and essentially the ant becomes a puppet of the fungus. The fungus then controls the ant to climb onto either a branch or stem, and then it forces the ant to grip onto that branch or stem so that it's kind of locked into place. And once there, the fungus will basically eat the insides of the ant and grow this kind of mushroom looking thing from the ant's head. And from there, it releases spores that infects other ants. And because the infected ant is at a higher elevation, or there's a greater chance that the spores will fall and land on other ants below, or it gets picked up by the wind and gets blown away to possibly spread into another ant colony. And there's a really good Planet Earth documentary made by the BBC. You should definitely watch it. So Google or YouTube ants cordyceps. You should be able to see the video, and it is pretty freaky. Now for the good and bad news. The good news is that there are thousands of strains of cordyceps, but only Ophilocordyceps unilateralis has the ability to alter the brain of its host. Also, Ophilocordyceps unilateralis only affects one species. It only affects ants, and it looks like the other cordyceps species only affect insects. If you think that's the good news, what's the bad news? Well, the bad news is there are thousands of different species of cordyceps. That means it could be possible that maybe one species is able to survive in a mammal or a bird that eats the infected insect. And as we go up on the food chain, it could be possible that the chain leads back to humans and it infects humans, but this is extremely, extremely unlikely. But you can't completely rule out the possibility. The third and final possibility of a zombie outbreak is through biological engineering. So basically, you can say that viruses were created in a lab by humans. So humans suck. So the best example of this is the video game franchise Resident Evil. And fun side note, in Japan, where the game was first created, the game is actually called Biohazard. I don't know why they changed the title of the game for the English release, but I think it fits more in line with the story of the game. In the game, the zombies are infected with what is known as the tyrant virus, or T virus for short. So the T virus was developed by the fictional company Umbrella Pharmaceuticals in the late 60s. So just like Skynet, if you see a company called Umbrella Pharmaceuticals pop up in real life, that's a really big red flag right there, and you should burn it to the ground. I'm just kidding. According to the game lore, the T virus was developed as a way to eliminate the need for a large-scale army and generate revenue to go with the company's eugenics program. Originally, the requirements for the virus were that it had to be highly contagious and 100% lethal. But by 1978, development moved from these two requirements into a virus that mutates its host to be more physically stronger and remain alive despite organ failures and even severe brain damage. And the damage to the brain will lead the person to become highly aggressive and create an obsessive hunger, the state of cannibalism. Yes, I know this sounds pretty extreme, but it's a video game, so they have some creative liberties there. And I know you're probably thinking there can't possibly be a company developing a zombie virus, right? And you're probably right. There probably is no company that's developing a zombie virus right now. Not only is it completely illegal under the Geneva Conventions, but there's just too much risk involved with creating a zombie virus. As a company, why would you create a virus that kills millions of people? The bottom line of a company is to make money, and there's no money to be made killing millions of potential customers. And if you're an evil government funding this, why risk the potential that if something goes wrong and your entire state could get killed off by the virus you created? It's just not worth it. If that's the case, then why did I mention this as a possibility for the zombie apocalypse? Well, just because it won't happen doesn't mean it couldn't happen. You could have a rich billionaire who just doesn't care about the destruction of the human race, or someone who doesn't care about humans in general. I think we all know one billionaire who doesn't care about people. I'll let you decide who that is. But biologically creating a virus isn't the only way to engineer the zombie virus or zombie apocalypse. You can create zombies through drugs, and it's happened before. So on May 26, 2012, in Miami, Florida, a passing cyclist alerts police on what he thinks is a fight between two homeless men. Miami police officer Jose Ramirez is the first to arrive at the scene, and he does not believe what he is witnessing. He sees a man named Rudy Eugene who is naked and on top of a homeless man, Ronald Popo. Eugene is seen beating Popo and has visibly bit off most of Popo's face, including his left eye. That's right, bit off his face. So Officer Ramirez warned Eugene to stop, but reportedly all Eugene did was growl at Officer Ramirez and continue to bite off Popo's face. And when Eugene refused additional warnings from Officer Ramirez, Ramirez fired his gun at Eugene. The first shot was ineffective, so Ramirez fired another 4 rounds that eventually killed Eugene. And the craziest thing about that is you can watch the entire thing online. So the entire incident was captured by security cameras. And it's an 18-minute video that you can watch online. You can YouTube it if you dare, or if you're sick enough to do that. I'm just kidding. Yeah, you can watch it if you want. So amazingly, Popo survived the attack, but he's completely blind now. What happened exactly? Well, it's believed that Eugene was under the influence of bath salts, which is a street drug and it's a psychedelic drug. I don't know too much about bath salts, but there are tons of videos online that show people that are high from bath salts, and I have to say that they look and behave just like zombies. So there you go. You don't just look it up online. Type bath salts zombies on YouTube and you will see some freaky stuff. And there you go. It's possible that someone or some group could create a variant of bath salts that turns someone into a zombie. I guess the good news is that if it is a drug doing it, then it's probably not going to be contagious and you won't catch it if someone bites your face off. And that's it for the possibilities of a zombie virus. Sorry, I lied. There's a fourth possibility, and that's the supernatural. It's extremely unlikely that this is the case, but you can't gloss over the fact that the origins of zombies are essentially supernatural. I think a lot of people forget that the original OG zombies didn't come from a virus or a parasite, but from the supernatural. You know, even if you look at Night of the Living Dead, the zombies in the movie were summoned from the grave and not through a virus. They were nothing like the zombies we know today. And who knows, maybe those Haitian priests are right. Maybe it is possible to summon the souls of the dead. And finally, I just want to end this with a few last kind of closing remarks. It is highly unlikely that a zombie outbreak will happen. The circumstances that will lead up to one are just too statistically unlikely to happen. If I were to put it in terms of odds, I would say that the odds of this happening are kind of like the odds of you winning the lottery every single week for an entire year. So yeah, imagine that. And also, contrary to a lot of popular belief about zombies being kind of quote undead, in all the possible scenarios, zombies can't be undead because they can't be dead. They're moving because something's controlling their body to move. And if they're dead, then the virus or fungus or whatever it is, it can't revive a dead body. With all the modern science and modern medicine in the world, it's impossible to revive a dead anything. I would like to add that I know there are some super hardcore fans out there who are probably angry about something about The Walking Dead or The Last of Us, assuming you're still here. And I'm sorry, I'm only one person and there's almost so much research I could do by myself. I have watched and played a little bit of each of these games and movies and TV shows, so I'm kind of like, I've wet my feet a little bit in them, so I know a little bit, but please feel free to correct me if something I said was wrong, which is probably the case. And again, please don't freak out about the zombie apocalypse. It's probably not going to happen. But if you are interested in a what-if scenario and how to survive should it happen, then tune in next week for part 2, where I'll talk about what will happen and how to survive in a zombie apocalypse. And thanks for sticking around this far into the podcast. If you made it this far, I just want to say thank you so much for sticking around. this far into the podcast. And as always, thanks for tuning in. This has been your moment of Zen. And until next time, take care, stay fresh. See ya.